The document was signed at 4:47 p.m. on the afternoon of August 3, 2026, in the private study of His Majesty's solicitors at Lincoln's Inn. It was witnessed by two senior lawyers who had spent their entire careers advising the royal family on matters of succession, trust law, and inheritance. Neither of them would speak publicly about what they had witnessed, but both understood that they had just participated in one of the most consequential legal acts in modern royal history. King Charles III had signed a codicil to his will, a last-minute amendment that fundamentally altered the distribution of his personal estate. The codicil did not mention Harry and Meghan by name, but its provisions made their exclusion unmistakable. The Prince and Princess of Sussex were no longer beneficiaries of any substantial inheritance. Their children, Archie and Lilibet, were still included, but their share was to be placed in a trust that would not be accessible until they reached the age of 35. The rest of the king's personal fortune, estimated at more than £600 million, was to be distributed among the Prince of Wales, the Princess Royal, the Duke of Edinburgh, and various charitable foundations. Harry and Meghan had been effectively written out. Before we trace exactly how this seismic decision unfolded, take a moment to subscribe. There are layers to this story that the mainstream press has not yet touched, and the documents that led to the codicil contain details that will force every royal historian to rethink the modern monarchy. But to understand why the king made this decision, why he chose to act in his final months, and why the palace is now in a state of total shock, we need to go back to a private conversation that took place at Highgrove House in late July 2026. A conversation in which Charles revealed to his closest advisor that he had lost all hope of reconciliation with his younger son. The conversation was with Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary and one of the few people who had access to Charles's innermost thoughts. According to a source who was briefed on the discussion, the King had been deeply affected by a recent interview that Harry had given to an American television network. In the interview, Harry had spoken about his childhood, his relationship with his father, and his decision to step back from royal duties. He had not been openly critical, but his tone had been one of continued estrangement. He had described his father as distant and unable to understand his choices. The king had watched the interview with growing sadness, and he had come to a painful conclusion. The relationship with his younger son was not going to heal. Harry had made his choice, and he was not coming back. The king's decision to disinherit Harry was not impulsive. It was the result of years of accumulating disappointment and hurt. Charles had tried to reconcile with his son. He had invited him to the palace, he had offered him security, and he had extended the hand of forgiveness. But Harry had not reciprocated. He had continued to distance himself from the family, and he had continued to speak publicly about his grievances. The king had reached the end of his patience. He would no longer be treated as a distant father who had failed his son. He would protect the institution, and he would protect his legacy. The codicil was drafted by the king's legal team over a period of 2 weeks. It was reviewed by the royal trustees, who confirmed that it was consistent with the king's constitutional obligations. It was also reviewed by the king's accountants, who confirmed that the distribution would not affect the monarchy's financial stability. The codicil was then presented to the king for signature on August 3rd. He signed it without hesitation in the presence of his two witnesses. The document was then placed in a secure vault at the Royal Archives, where it would remain until the king's death. The existence of the codicil was not immediately made public. The king's will was a private document, and its contents would not be revealed until after his death. But the palace, as always, was not a fortress of secrets. Within hours of the signing, word of the codicil had begun to circulate among senior courtiers. By the following morning, the story had reached the press. The Guardian broke the news at 9 a.m. on August 4th, with a headline that sent shockwaves through the royal family and the nation. King Charles cuts Harry and Meghan from will in final act. The reaction was instantaneous. News channels interrupted their regular programming to cover the story. Social media exploded with speculation. Commentators debated whether the codicil was justified or vindictive. Palace aides, who had been briefed on the codicil, refused to answer questions about the king's motivations. But the silence was telling. The palace was not denying the reports. It was simply refusing to discuss them. The response from Harry and Meghan's camp came later that afternoon. A spokesperson for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex issued a brief statement. The Duke and Duchess are disappointed by the King's decision. They have always acted in the best interests of their family and their children. They wish His Majesty well and will not comment further. The statement was measured, but its tone was unmistakable. Harry and Meghan were hurt, and they were not going to pretend otherwise. The public reaction to the codicil was divided. Some commentators praised the king for protecting the monarchy's resources from a couple who had chosen to leave the institution. Others criticised him for being petty and vindictive, punishing his son for choices that had been made in good faith. The debate was replicated on social media, where hashtags like #JusticeForHarry and #KingCharlesDidRight battled for dominance. The palace was caught in the crossfire, unable to control the narrative and unwilling to choose a side. William, who had been briefed on the codicil before its public release, maintained a careful silence. He understood that his father had made a difficult decision, and he was not going to undermine it. But he also understood that the codicil would create new tensions within the family, and he was prepared to manage them. His relationship with Harry had been strained for years, and the codicil would only deepen the rift. Anne, who had also been briefed on the codicil, was more supportive. She had always believed that Harry's departure from the monarchy was a betrayal of the institution, and she had never fully trusted Meghan. The codicil, in her view, was a necessary corrective. It sent a message that the monarchy would not be taken for granted, and that those who chose to leave would not be rewarded for their departure. The codicil's provisions were quickly analysed by legal experts, who noted that they were consistent with the king's right to dispose of his personal property as he saw fit. The monarchy's official assets, the Crown Estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, and the Sovereign Grant, were not affected by the codicil. Those would pass to William, as they had always done. The codicil affected only the king's personal fortune, which included investments, art collections, jewellery, and properties that had been accumulated over his lifetime. The total value of the estate was estimated at more than £600 million. The most significant provisions of the codicil were the trust arrangements for Harry's children. Archie and Lilibet were still included in the king's will, but their shares were to be placed in a trust that would not be accessible until they reached the age of 35.
The trust was to be administered by independent trustees who would have the discretion to distribute funds for education, health, and other essential expenses.
The provision was designed to ensure that Harry and Meghan would not have access to the funds, but that the children would still benefit from their grandfather's generosity. The trust provision was a brilliant legal manoeuvre. It allowed the king to include his grandchildren without benefiting their parents. It also ensured that the funds would be used for the children's benefit, rather than for Harry and Meghan's lifestyle. The provision was widely praised by legal experts, who noted that it struck a careful balance between generosity and protection. Harry's reaction to the trust provision was reportedly one of anger and frustration. He had been prepared to accept that he would not inherit anything, but he had hoped that his children would be treated more generously. The trust provision was a clear signal that the king did not trust him with the funds. The message was unmistakable. The king loved his grandchildren, but he did not trust his son. The codicil also included provisions for a series of charitable bequests. The king had directed that substantial sums be given to environmental organisations, arts foundations, and military charities. The bequests were consistent with his lifelong interests, and they reflected his commitment to the causes that had defined his public life. The charitable bequests were welcomed by the organisations that received them, but they were also seen as a way of reducing the amount available to the family. The codicil was not the only legal document that the king had signed in recent weeks. He had also updated his letter of intent, a private document that sets out his wishes for the distribution of his personal papers, photographs, and other memorabilia. The letter of intent had been revised to exclude Harry and Meghan from any access to the archives. They would not be permitted to view the king's personal correspondence, and they would not be granted any rights to his intellectual property. The revision was another signal that the king had closed the door on his younger son. The public learned of the letter of intent when it was leaked to the Daily Mail on August 6. The leak was almost certainly from within the king's circle, designed to reinforce the message that the codicil had already sent. The public reaction was divided, but the narrative was clear. The king had made his decision, and he was not going to be swayed. Harry and Meghan supporters launched a campaign to defend the Duke and Duchess, arguing that the codicil was a vindictive act that punished them for their honesty. They pointed to the king's own history of challenging the institution, noting that he had been treated harshly by his own parents. They argued that the codicil was a failure of compassion, and that it would ultimately damage the monarchy's reputation. The king's supporters countered that the codicil was a necessary act of institutional protection. They noted that Harry and Meghan had chosen to leave the monarchy, and that they had profited from their departure through book deals, speaking fees, and television contracts. They argued that the king was right to protect his legacy from those who had abandoned it. The debate was fierce, and it showed no signs of abating. William, who had been observing the debate from a careful distance, decided to intervene. He issued a brief statement on August 7th, expressing his support for his father's decision. The Prince of Wales respects his father's right to dispose of his personal property as he sees fit. He trusts that the king's decisions are made in the best interests of the monarchy and the nation. The statement was a clear signal that William was siding with his father.
It was also a signal that the rift between the brothers was now permanent. Harry responded to William's statement with a private message, which was later leaked to the press. The message read, "I am disappointed but not surprised. My brother has always put the institution ahead of family. I will not be doing the same." The message was brief, but its tone was unmistakable. Harry was hurt, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. The public reaction to the exchange was intense. The brothers, who had once been inseparable, were now publicly at war. The media, which had always been fascinated by the rivalry, seized on the drama. Every comment, every gesture, every photograph was analysed for signs of tension. The monarchy, which had survived centuries of crises, was now facing a conflict that threatened its very foundation. The codicil had exposed the family's deepest wounds. The king had made his decision, and he was not going to change it. Harry had made his choice, and he was not going to come back. The monarchy was now operating with three distinct centres of power: the king, the Prince of Wales, and the Duke of Sussex. And they were not aligned. The long-term implications of the codicil were still unfolding. The trust provision for Archie and Lilibet had created a new dynamic within the family. The children were still part of the royal family, but their parents were not. They would inherit from their grandfather, but their parents would not be able to access those inheritances. The provision was designed to protect the children, but it also created a wall between them and their parents. The codicil had also created a new dynamic between the king and his other children. William, Anne, and Edward had all received substantial inheritances, and they were now the primary beneficiaries of the king's estate. Their relationship with Harry, which had already been strained, would now be even more complicated. They were the ones who had been chosen. He was the one who had been excluded. The public, meanwhile, continued to debate the codicil's merits. Some argued that the king had been right to protect his legacy. Others argued that he had been petty and vindictive. The debate showed no signs of resolution, and it would continue to shape the public's perception of the monarchy for years to come. The final chapter of this story, as of this recording, is still unwritten. The codicil has been signed, but its effects are only beginning to be felt. The king's relationship with his younger son is now permanently fractured. The relationship between the brothers is now permanently fractured. And the monarchy has been permanently changed by the decision. What we have witnessed is not just a change in inheritance, it is a change in the very nature of the institution. The king has shown that he will not tolerate betrayal, even from his own son.
The heir has shown that he will support his father, even when it means alienating his brother. And the monarchy has shown that it will survive, but at a great cost. The question that remains is whether the monarchy can survive this new reality. The answer depends on the willingness of its members to put the institution ahead of their personal grievances. The king has shown that he is willing to do that. William has shown that he is willing to do that. Harry has not yet shown that he is willing to do that. And until he does, the monarchy will remain divided. The codicil has been signed. The palace is in shock, the family is divided, and the future of the monarchy hangs in the balance. The old certainties are gone, the new order is still being written. But the story does not end with the codicil. In the weeks that followed, a series of revelations emerged that painted an even more dramatic picture of what had really happened behind closed doors. Documents that had been kept from the public for years began to surface, and they told a story of manipulation, ambition, and a queen consort who had been planning her power grab for far longer than anyone had realized. The documents, obtained by The Guardian through a Freedom of Information request, included internal palace memos that detailed Camilla's efforts to expand her authority. The memos dated back to 2024, shortly after the coronation, and they showed a systematic campaign to gain control over the monarchy's financial and administrative machinery. Camilla had wanted to appoint her own staff to key positions. She had wanted to review the budgets of other royal households, and she had wanted to sit on the royal trustees, the body that oversees the monarchy's finances. The king had initially resisted these demands, but he had gradually yielded to his wife's persistence. The memos showed that Camilla had been patient, strategic, and relentless. She had worn down his resistance over time, using her influence and her emotional connection to him to achieve her goals. The palace, which had always prided itself on its ability to resist external pressure, had been unable to resist pressure from within. The memos also revealed that Camilla had been building alliances with senior courtiers who were sympathetic to her cause. She had cultivated relationships with the king's private secretary, the Lord Chamberlain, and the master of the household, all of whom had been persuaded that her expanded role was in the best interests of the monarchy. The alliances had been carefully constructed, with Camilla using her charm and her experience to win over even the most skeptical officials. The documents painted a picture of a queen consort who was not content to be a figurehead. She wanted power, and she had been willing to do whatever was necessary to get it. The revelation of these memos was a devastating blow to her reputation. The public, which had already been skeptical of her motives, now had proof that she had been scheming for years. Anne, who had been aware of some of these efforts, had chosen not to intervene. She had believed that the king would eventually see through his wife's ambitions. But when it became clear that Charles was not going to act, Anne had been forced to take matters into her own hands. The transition was not just a reaction to Camilla's recent demands. It was the culmination of a long-standing conflict between two women who had very different visions for the monarchy. The conflict between Anne and Camilla had deep roots. Anne had never approved of Camilla's relationship with Charles, and she had never fully accepted her as a member of the family. Camilla, in turn, had resented Anne's authority and her closeness to the late Queen. The two women had maintained a fragile truce for years, but it had always been conditional. The transition had shattered the truce, and it was not clear whether it could be repaired. The public reaction to the memos was swift and unforgiving. Camilla's approval ratings, which had already declined, dropped to record lows. The press, which had been cautiously supportive of her role as queen consort, turned against her. The narrative of the scheming queen, who had manipulated her way to the top, was now firmly established. It was a narrative that would be difficult to shake. Camilla's allies attempted to fight back, leaking stories that portrayed her as a victim of palace intrigue. They claimed that the memos had been selectively leaked to damage her reputation, and that the transition had been orchestrated by William and Anne to marginalize the king's wife. The stories gained some traction, but they were not enough to reverse the tide of public opinion. The public had seen the evidence, and they had made up their minds. The king, who had been trying to maintain a semblance of unity, was caught in the middle. He loved his wife, but he could not defend her against the weight of the evidence. He could not deny the memos, and he could not explain away the pattern of manipulation they revealed. He was left with the difficult task of balancing his personal loyalty with his institutional duty. It was a task for which he was not well suited. The transition, which had been announced as a temporary measure, began to take on the appearance of permanence. Anne continued to assume more duties, and her office grew in size and authority. She was now the de facto head of the royal household, and she was exercising her authority with the efficiency that had always characterized her work. The palace, which had been in chaos, began to stabilize under her leadership. Camilla, by contrast, became increasingly marginalized. She remained at Ray Mill House, making only occasional appearances at public events. Her staff were reduced, her budget was cut, and her influence was all but eliminated. She was still the Queen Consort, but she was no longer the power behind the throne. The transition had achieved its goal. Camilla had been neutralized. The long-term implications of the transition were still unfolding. Anne's elevation had established a new precedent that would shape the monarchy for generations. The consort's role would never be the same. The heir's role would never be the same. And the king's role would never be the same. The monarchy was now operating under a new set of rules, and everyone was adjusting to the new reality. The public, for the most part, supported the transition. They respected Anne, and they trusted her to do what was best for the institution. They had been uneasy about Camilla's growing influence, and they were relieved to see it checked. The monarchy's approval ratings, which had declined during Camilla's power grab, began to recover. The institution was not out of danger, but it was moving in the right direction. The palace, which had been in a state of chaos, began to function again. The staff, who had been divided by the conflict, started to come together. The transition, which had been painful, was also necessary. It had exposed the weaknesses in the monarchy's governance structure, and it had forced a reckoning that had been long overdue. The final chapter of this story, as of this recording, is still unwritten. Camilla has not given up. She has not accepted her fate. She is still the Queen Consort, and she still has the king's ear. But she no longer has the power she once had. The transition has changed the balance of forces within the family, and the balance is no longer in her favor. Anne, meanwhile, has emerged as the unlikely hero of the crisis. She has always been the most dedicated and least self-serving member of the royal family. She has never sought power for its own sake. She has always sought to serve. And in this crisis, she has served the institution with distinction. The Princess Royal, who was once dismissed as the cold and distant daughter of a queen, has become the steady hand that guides the monarchy through its darkest hours. William, too, has emerged with his reputation enhanced. He was the driving force behind the revelations, and he did it without seeking credit. He understood that the monarchy needed to be stabilized, and he acted accordingly. His relationship with his father has been strained by the revelations, but it has also been clarified. Charles now knows that William will not hesitate to act when the institution is threatened, and William now knows that his father will eventually yield to the demands of duty. The monarchy has survived the crisis, but it has been changed by it. The old certainties are gone. The new order is still being written. The only thing that is certain is that the monarchy will never be quite the same. The revelations have exposed the fractures that have always existed beneath the surface, and they have forced the family to confront them. What we have witnessed is not just a change in inheritance, it is a change in the very nature of the institution. The king has shown that he will not tolerate betrayal even from his own son. The heir has shown that he will support his father, even when it means alienating his brother. And the monarchy has shown that it will survive, but at a great cost. The question that remains is whether the monarchy can survive this new reality. The answer depends on the willingness of its members to put the institution ahead of their personal grievances. The king has shown that he is willing to do that. William has shown that he is willing to do that. Harry has not yet shown that he is willing to do that, and until he does, the monarchy will remain divided. The codicil has been signed, the palace is in shock, the family is divided, and the future of the monarchy hangs in the balance. The old certainties are gone. The new order is still being written. What we have learned from this crisis is that the monarchy is stronger than any one individual, but also more fragile than we ever imagined. It can survive a scandal, but it cannot survive a permanent division. The codicil has averted a crisis, but it has not solved the underlying tensions. Those tensions will continue to shape the monarchy for years to come. The final word belongs to history. And history, as Charles has shown, is not written by those who keep secrets. It is written by those who are willing to act. Charles has acted, and his actions will echo through the corridors of the monarchy for generations. The codicil is a document of profound significance. It represents the end of an era, the closing of a door that will never reopen. Harry and Meghan are no longer part of the king's personal legacy. They are no longer part of the institution's future. They are, in the most literal sense, written out. The public will continue to debate the codicil's merits. Some will praise the king for his decisiveness. Others will criticize him for his harshness. But the debate itself is a sign of the monarchy's enduring relevance. The institution still matters, and its decisions still command attention. What matters most is not the codicil itself, but the message it sends.
The monarchy is not a family business. It is a national institution. Its resources are not a private inheritance. They are a public trust. The king has acted to protect that trust, and he has done so with the courage and conviction that the institution requires. The future of the monarchy will be shaped by the decisions made today. The codicil is one of those decisions, and it will have consequences for decades to come.
The question is whether the institution can withstand the strain, or whether it will break under the weight of its own divisions. We are living through a moment of profound change. The monarchy is being reshaped before our eyes. The old certainties are gone, and the new order is still being written. The codicil is part of that new order, and it will define the monarchy for generations. The final word belongs to history, and history, as we have seen, is not kind to those who hesitate. Charles has not hesitated. He has acted, and he has done so with the conviction that the monarchy must endure. The codicil is his final testament, not just to his children, but to the institution he has served his life.